Hey everyone, Tactics here with more Season 3 Mythic Plus guys, where this time we've got the brand new dungeon coming with patch 11.2, Ecodome DANI, and I'll be giving you the rundown here on everything that you need to know from important trash abilities, boss strategies, and just other tips and tricks that we've learned on the PTR to help you breeze through this dungeon at the start of next season. And on top of that, I'm going to be putting out my pug-friendly route video out in the near future, so make sure you are subscribed for that, as well as other PvE guide content. Enough talking though, let's hop right into the key. Where to start, you'll be fighting a bunch of aberration mobs where overgorged mites have one of the most important interrupts in the dungeon in Gorge. Basically what this does is a random target hit, and if successful it applies a stacking buff to the mob, and when they die they will explode, applying a stacking shadow dot to the entire group based on the number of stacks that the mob had. So the more kicks that go off here means more group damage at the end, so very important to interrupt these mobs, as well as these small invading mites, will also just randomly jump around and hit players for shadow damage. So you want to make sure that as much as you can, you do play in melee range of the mobs, just so that the cleave up time is a bit better. While you are playing in melee, beware of the Voracious Gorger Smash, because this ability will put circles underneath all players on top of doing some damage to the entire group. And obviously if you're in melee, it can be quite cluttered when those circles go out. On top of this, the Ravenous Destroyer Lieutenant mob also has two abilities that may impact your space. First is the Gluttonous Miasma debuff. This goes out on a random player and is a dot that will splash in a 5-yard radius. So you need to make sure you move away from the rest of your group, as the damage this does will heal the mob itself, which is very bad, obviously. The other ability it has is Volatile Ejection, which shoots a line attack at a random player, which cannot be avoided by that player. So I recommend having the target just stand still so everyone else has an easy time avoiding it. And in both cases, with either of those abilities, if that ever overlapped with any of the AoE damage going out, like the mobs dying or the smash that we previously mentioned, the target will want to make sure that they press a defensive. After fighting through all of these aberrations, you'll eventually reach the first boss, Azhiccar, which is a giant stationary worm, meaning tanks will need to stay in melee range the entire fight, or he will thrash for group damage. In the first phase, there are a couple of abilities to worry about. The first is Invading Shriek. This deals physical damage to your group and then summons 6 frenzied might adds from set spawn locations around the room. And these guys just fixate random players and use that same random target shadow damage jump that I talked about earlier. However, in the case of these mites specifically, they'll also gain a stacking 10% damage buff every time they jump, so it's important to cleave them down quickly. I recommend stacking as a group close to the boss to bait all these mobs to one area, and you can use AoE CCs to lock them down while you cleave the boss and these mobs at the same time. The other main ability here is Toxic Regurgitation, which targets 2 non-tank players and drops a puddle under them after a short delay, applying a 6-second dot to any one hit, and that puddle does a massive slow. Of course, you don't want these puddles dropping on your group, so you want to move them away towards the edges of the platform, and you can potentially even drop them on where those ads spawn to slow them on their spawn, both in this phase as well as in phase 2. And let's talk about that now. So when the boss reaches full energy, he'll begin to cast Devour, and this creates a death zone around the boss itself, so do not be in that circle. And then while this is happening, the boss pulls all players constantly for 18 seconds. At the same time, 6 more of those frenzied mites will spawn around the room, but instead of attacking players, they just move straight towards the boss. And if any player or those mites end up getting hit by that death zone around the boss, they'll gain a nasty damage amp, likely leading to a wipe. So you want to swap these mites ASAP and use things like stuns, slows, and knockbacks to prevent them from reaching the boss. And that's where potentially, if you had dropped a slow puddle on these spawn points, which are defined, they're always in the same 4 potential spots, it could buy you a few extra seconds. Now, after this 18-second channel ends, the boss does consume any remaining living mites and returns back to the initial boss phase, so you can't just CC these mites and ignore them. You do have to actually make sure they die, otherwise the boss fight just repeats. After you defeat Azhiccar, you can move on into the dungeon, where you'll stop facing aberration mobs and you'll begin to face a bunch of ethereal trash mobs. The main lieutenant in this area are the overcharged sentinels, which have half their health as an absorb shield protecting their core. Once this is removed, they begin to constantly pulse for random target damage from their now unstable core, which leaves behind a puddle with each hit as well. So it's very important that sub 50% you focus these mobs, as this is the largest source of damage in this part of the dungeon. Outside of that, they also have a tank buster frontal ability in Arcane Slash, so make sure this is pointed away from your group and your tank presses a defensive. For kicks, you'll want to prioritize Arcing Zap from the Wastelander Farstalkers, which is a random target arcane hit that chains to other players. All of your other spare kicks will go into the Bolt from the Wasteland Ritualist, and these mobs also actually have a magic debuff in Arcing Energy that goes out on a random player, so healers be ready with a Dispel, and make sure you kind of pre-spread to avoid that cleaving other players. The only other relevant mob in this area are the Tamed Runestalkers, who just occasionally teleport behind a random player and then try and do a warp line attack through them, so make sure you are avoiding that, or you can also use a CC to stop the cast entirely. After making your way deeper into the Ecodome, you'll be able to fight the duo Taah'bat and Awaj, though most of this encounter is only going to be fighting one of them at a time, starting with Awaj. For tanks, there's the Rift Claws Buster, which is a heavy arcane hit followed by an 8-second bleed, so make sure you always have a defensive ready for this, and use Bleed Cleanse if you have them. For everyone else, 2 random players will occasionally get targeted by Binding Javelin. This is an 8-yard AoE around them and then tethers anyone hit to a spear on the ground, which you need to destroy in order to free them. Immunes also do work here, so that is a good thing to note, as that can be very useful, as it can be quite dangerous if you're tethered and then targeted by other abilities. I recommend putting these in a Venn diagram formation close to the boss, allowing your tank to easily then move the boss between these javelins so you can cleave both of them for maximum damage. You do want to break these tethers relatively quickly, as if it overlaps with the Warp Strike ability, it can be quite dangerous. This is just a random target line attack that applies a dot to anyone hit by it, so make sure that everyone who is not targeted by it gets out of the path, and if you are targeted by it and you're not in a javelin, make sure you point this away from the javelins, and you may want to press a defensive here as well. When the boss reaches full energy, they'll use Arcane Blitz, causing Taah'bat to dismount, but be immune to damage until you hit him with 6 casts of that Warp Strike line attack. At the same time, he is pulsing for constant group damage, and then Awash is just spamming those Warp Strike abilities in sets of 3, so the targeted players need to make sure that they put the line through the boss to break the shield. At the same time, you do want to make sure that you are not getting cleaved by other dashes, as the dot can stack up and be very, very scary in this phase. So be careful. Look at the order that the lines are spawned in. That is the order that the boss will charge those players. This is also the point where you'd want to pop healing cooldowns with all the damage going out, all the dots, the pulsing damage. And if you ever do get multiple stacks of that dot, that is where you want to press a defensive. Once you've destroyed the shield, both bosses will be stunned and stacked up for 15 seconds, so that's where you can pop your damage and go crazy, as they do share health. Once the duo is defeated, you can make your way outside the Ecodome, where you'll encounter more ethereals as well as some beasts. The most dangerous mob by far are the Wastelander Pack Speakers. These are lieutenant mobs, and they have a couple big abilities on top of the random target bolt, which you'll want to keep kicked. First is Erratic Ritual. This is the main source of damage in this part of the dungeon. This pulses just for heavy arcane damage over 6 seconds, so you want healing CDs and potentially even defensives if it ever overlaps with another damaging ability. On top of that, there's Consume Spirit, which puts a 99% DR on the Pack Speaker itself and spawns a nearby spirit that it is channeling into. You want to kill this spirit ASAP, because every 3 seconds, the Pack Speaker will gain a 10% health absorb shield as it channels into that spirit. So the faster you kill the spirit, the less healing this mob is going to get. Outside of that, there's another purgeable absorb shield in Embrace of Koresh from the Koresh elementals in this area. It just goes out on random mobs, so if you have the ability to remove magic buffs, this can speed that up a little bit. Also, throughout this part of the dungeon, you will see piles of dirt in the ground, which you definitely want to avoid, as if you get close to them, it will spawn a burrowing creeper, which is probably the most dangerous lieutenant mob in this area. If you do accidentally pull one, just beware there's going to be a ton of AoE damage, both in the form of dots from their Stinging Sandstorm, as well as a large individual hit in Earth Crusher, so you need big defensives here, especially if they have a back-to-back cast. Now, there's also some buffs in this area, so you'll see several arcane siphons which players can interact with to power them up, which grants anyone within 15 yards the Koreshi Surge buff, which is 10% haste and speed for 30 seconds. This is worth grabbing if it's in your path, but it is not worth pulling extra difficult trash to unlock a few more of these, so make sure you do use them if they're in the way, but don't do anything crazy to get them. And keep in mind that you cannot channel into them while you're in combat, so you do need to get the buff before pulling a pack, not during. For enchanters, there's actually another bonus in this area if you have at least 25 Azhiccar skill, which is an arcane conduit in the center of the ruins. If you channel into it for 4 seconds using the extra action button, it will cause an explosion that stuns all nearby enemies for 10 seconds. That is a hefty stun, so quite useful if you grab a big pull and do it near this arcane conduit. But overall, it's a relatively minor bonus, so you don't need to go out of your way to ensure you have an enchanter in your group. From there, we can discuss the final boss, Soul-Scribe, which is a pretty interesting encounter that makes use of both damage increases and decreases depending on how you handle the mechanics. Basically, every time the boss does an ability, he does an arcane hit to all players, which shatters a soul fragment onto the ground. If this fragment gets hit by any of the boss abilities which shortly follows, you'll get debuffed with the Wounded Fate, which deals dot damage and reduces your haste by a massive 30% for 8 seconds, so you want to avoid your fragment getting hit at all costs. So, how do we do that? It's quite simple. All you need to do is run over your soul fragment, which is indicated by an arrow over its head. And if you do pick it up, you'll instead gain the Fate-bound stacking buff, which increases your damage and healing by 10% for 10 seconds. In terms of what abilities are that the boss uses to kill these fragments, the first is Ceremonial Dagger. There's a line attack that is aimed at each fragment, and it casts after 5 seconds. So when this goes out, you just look where is your fragment, and you go pick it up and move out of the line. The harder one to handle is Dread of the Unknown. This puts a 9-yard AoE around all players, which explodes after only 4 seconds here. So you need to quickly find your fragment, which seems to always spawn around you, as opposed to the dagger cast, which kind of spawns around the room somewhere in set positions. And then once you've picked your fragment up, you need to spread out to avoid cleaving other players. Obviously, this is a bit easier if you're pre-spread to begin with, so make sure you do that just to make your life a bit easier. The hit from this ability on you is also quite dangerous on its own, so you may want to press a defensive here, especially if you're not topped. Health pot's also a good option there. When the boss reaches full energy, they'll begin to channel Eternal Weave, which instead of 1 soul fragment actually shatters off 3, while creating 2 cones that rotate around the platform clockwise every 6 seconds for the 24-second duration. While you can pick all your fragments up right away, you can also opt to min-max the buff duration and pick them up one at a time as the cones move over them, which constantly refreshes your buff with each stack, allowing for more overall uptime on this buff, which means a lot more damage. This won't be necessary for your weekly keys, of course, just a little thing that you can do to get a bit more damage out. Outside of that, the boss just constantly is pulsing for AoE damage, so there is actually something for healers to do. Otherwise, this fight just kind of repeats from there. But there we have it, guys. That is my Ecodome Aldani guide for the War Within Season 3. Hopefully you did learn something here, and if you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more dungeon and raid content, including that pug-friendly Mythic Plus Root video to start out the season, as well as raid guides for Mana Forge Omega on normal, heroic, and mythic difficulty. Of course, I need to give a big thank you to all my amazing Patreons for their continued support, and I'll see everyone in the next video.